Hello watch enthusiasts and welcome to Watch Chronicler. The Blancpain 50 Fathoms is a complicated watch to address. In the 1950s it was a revolutionary device which provided the format now accepted as the dive watch. In the 1960s it became known for its widespread military use, and again in the early 2000s it became a serious contender in the luxury dive watch field after the recreation of Blancpain a few years prior. However, the last few years have given us not only a lineage of successive 50 Fathoms generations, but also an assortment of reissues and vintage-inspired models which without context can be extremely difficult to approach. In today's video, join me on the ultimate journey through these limited edition 50 Fathoms, each with their own history, background and importance to the confusing and often unclear story of the 50 Fathoms itself through the ages. If you do enjoy this video, please remember to like, subscribe and to hit the bell icon to always know about the latest videos here on Watch Chronicler. Also follow us on Instagram for more content, or head over to watchchronicler.com to find our articles and podcasts too. By the way, the sponsor of this video is Aquastar, but more on that later. Perhaps curiously, our story doesn't begin in 1953 with the launch of that original 50 Fathoms dive watch, but instead in 1999, the year that Blancpain chose to resurrect their dive watch. You see, Blancpain was brought back from the dead in the early 1980s by none other than Jean-Claude Biver and Jacques Piguet of the movement manufacturer Frédéric Piguet. This pair bought the rights to the brand from Omega, Blancpain's former sister brand under the ownership of SSIH. During the first decade of the brand's existence, the obvious objective was to cultivate an image of refined traditional luxury with an extreme emphasis on Swiss watchmaking heritage, despite the fact that Blancpain was never previously regarded in such light. Nevertheless, by the late 1990s, the desire for sports watches, and in particular dive watches, had grown beyond the point of notice. In order to address this new market, Blancpain launched the 50 Fathoms, with the now recognisable bulbous case, sized here at 40.5mm, squared off numerals and markers, and an altogether more luxurious attitude than their technical dive watches of the 1950s, 60s and 70s. A particular change, aside from a comprehensively new attitude, was the addition of a metal relief bezel, a change which didn't stick. The next major return, however, was far more of a milestone for the 50 Fathoms, and truly showed the future of the collection. This was the 2007 50 Fathoms Automatique, which fundamentally took the design and inner workings of its predecessor and made an enduring classic from them in a large, polished 45mm case with a domed sapphire bezel, domed sapphire crystal, and rounded markers to give a vintage, classical design. Whilst this watch did not replicate any vintage reference per se, its simple appearance could lead one to think of the very first 50 Fathoms commissioned by Claude Riffaut and Bob Maloubier for their new covert French military diving team in 1953. That original watch was also the product of a diving accident during which Mr. Fichter, the CEO of Blancpain, ran out of air whilst diving and realised that a watch would be a seriously useful product for this application. A shared thought then, you might say. The original didn't have access to a screw-down crown due to Rolex's patent, but did offer a caseback which was secured with an independent screwing ring to avoid O-ring damage. Of course, the modern generation brought modern specifications, such as the 300-metre water resistance, that's 164 fathoms to the 91 metres originally thought to be the limit of human resistance, and therefore the name of the original, and the calibre 1315, which, for the period, was seriously impressive. This gave a 5-day power reserve, automatic winding, and a beautiful construction. It was from this springboard that many of the pieces in this video originate. The first true vintage throwback 50 Fathoms arrived in 2010, although I believe they actually went on sale in 2011, in the form of the tribute to 50 Fathoms No Radiation. Most immediately, it's obvious that this model pays direct homage to a unique period in the 50 Fathoms tenure. During the 1950s, radium was crucial to the illumination of true technical watches, as due to its powerful ionising powers, it delivered a bright blue glow. In fact, in the original brief for the 50 Fathoms creation, it was stated that the watch should glow like a star to guide a shepherd. However, radium became more and more known to deliver a potent dose of alpha particles over a very long 1600-year half-life. Due to this, Blancpain added the inscription "Danger, if found return to nearest military facility" to their military pieces, and clearly this wasn't an appropriate endorsement for a civilian watch alongside a military one, or for any customer preferring a less radioactive option. As a result, Blancpain began to offer watches with dials marked specifically to show that these examples didn't deliver such hefty doses, although strictly speaking those watches remained radioactive, as until the 1990s, radioactive decay was the only way to illuminate a dial. The most famous examples of this practice were produced for the civilian market and for those sold to the German Navy from the mid-1960s to the early 1970s. In the same case and with the same movement as the standard watch, The 2010 edition of 500 replicated these watches with a few key details, including a fully graduated bezel, the movement of the date to 3 o'clock, and the redesigning of the dial. Here the applied markers were replaced with painted ones, including the iconic lozenge at 12, and the original dial was replaced with a mix of subtle sunburst finishes. Of course, the key change was the addition of a no radiations symbol at 6 o'clock. Something to point out is that at this point, all 50 Fathoms models featured a solid case pack with an internal soft iron layer for anti-magnetism. Since then, a lot of 50 Fathoms watches have silicon components within the movement, and so no longer need this level of protection. In 2011 came the next noteworthy release, the Blancpain tribute to 50 Fathoms Aqualung. This watch adopted an awful lot from previous models, but as Blancpain learned to push the collection in new directions, it did provide a lot of desirable features. Historically speaking, the Aqualung model refers to a myriad of pieces from the late 1950s to the 1970s. However, it seems that the model they were keen to replicate was a variant with square, utilitarian Arabic numerals and straight polished hands. This was, by the way, one of the very first models in the collection to offer a 300-metre water resistance back in the middle of the 20th century. Interestingly, it was via Spirotechnique, the predecessor of Aqualung, that the original specifications reached Blancpain from the French Navy, and indeed these watches were sold through the brand afterwards. The remake retained the 45mm steel case, but now offered it with a brushed finish, the 5-minute graduations bezel of the 2007 release, and an exhibition caseback. On early examples, you were greeted with an automatic rotor in the form of a Nautilus, whilst later models had a ship's propeller instead. The black dial was structurally very similar to previous models, and matched their finish. What did change was the return of the date to the 4:30 position, the presence of square Arabic numerals, and straight polished hands. If you're enjoying this video, I suspect that dive watches and the history of subaquatic exploration will be of interest, including work of Jacques Cousteau. Following his joint invention of the Aqualung in 1943 with Émile Gagnan, Cousteau's influence on many of our imaginations came with episodes of The Undersea World of Jacques Cousteau appearing from 1966 to 76 in its first run. What few may know, however, is that the watch seen in the first episode of this hugely influential series was the Aquastar Deep Star, perhaps the most important diving chronograph of all time, usable down to 100 metres, and with the provision to calculate necessary decompression for consecutive dives. Nevertheless, by the 21st century, the brand had all but disappeared from the diving scene. However, in 2020, under the new ownership of the Synchron Group, the company that brought back icons like the Doxa Sub in the early 2000s, Aquadive and also the Isofrane and Tropic straps, Aquastar is back with the brand new Deep Star, with modern specifications and classical looks. Watch our review to find out more, or head over to aquastar.ch to get your own piece of dive watch history. Whilst not strictly speaking a vintage offering, we should note that Blancpain released the Bathyscaphe in 2013, an angular, modern take on the 50 Fathoms with the same movement and water resistance. Otherwise the bezel was now flat, narrow and ceramic, whilst the dial was simple, minimalistic and extremely clean to show a different side to the Blancpain collection at a slightly reduced price. It was of course an expression of a very similar product in period, which was a redesign of the original appearance of the 50 Fathoms to suit a smaller wrist and a desire for the date. From this base, Blancpain released the 2016 50 Fathoms Bathyscaphe Revolution Special Edition, which celebrated the 10th anniversary of this publication with a vintage-inspired, although not overtly inspired, variant in 38mm with a brown dial, fully graduated bezel, and unique numerals. It's worth also noting that, whilst not featured in this video, it was in the 2014 to 2016 period that Blancpain also launched the flyback chronograph version of the Bathyscaphe, which will be mentioned again in relation to another key release. The next stop came in 2017, the first Baselworld release I witnessed, by the way, when Blancpain resurrected a gem from another part of its history, US military use. This all began when Alan Tourneck saw the watch in Switzerland and became the US distributor after discovering the US Navy was looking for essentially the same watch. However, US Navy models needed to feature a humidity indicator on the dial, and so was born in the late 1950s the Mil-Spec 1, which became standard issue for US military divers. This showed internal humidity with a circle on the dial, which changed colour from blue or white to red when exposed to water. In 2017, this watch was brought back, but more importantly, the new version guided Blancpain's future vision for this dive watch. The case design was similar to the normal 50 Fathoms, but now reduced in size to 40.3mm in fully polished steel. In order to achieve this, the smaller caliber 1151 was used, with automatic winding, a 4-day power reserve from 2 spring barrels, and a black-coated 18 karat gold rotor. The dial replicated the original in spirit at least, with straight hands, a redesigned vintage second hand, and simple painted markers as per the original. The humidity indicator appeared at 6 o'clock and the date remained, but was left rather unobtrusive at 4:30 in black. Crucially, this watch shed the overly luxurious previous appearance with just one very subtle sunburst pattern on the dial. The following year, 2018, Blancpain actually reused the format of the Mil-Spec to create the Ocean Commitment 3, a follow-up, by the way, to two previous versions which were both Bathyscaphe chronographs. And this watch replaced a polished case with a brushed one, the black dial with a blue one, the aged luminova with a yellow equivalent, and the moisture indicator with an emblem. A peripheral model which ought to be mentioned, yet is, in my opinion, the most unsuccessful vintage remake in Blancpain's portfolio, is the 2018 50 Fathoms Bathyscaphe Day-Date 70s, a watch designed to resurrect the appearance of what I believe to be the only internal bezel Blancpain 50 Fathoms released in that period. As with the original, the dial is a fumé sand colour with applied markers and a ring around the outside with Arabic numerals. However, whilst the original featured that outer ring as its internal rotating bezel, the new watch puts all of this, including the day-date complication which cuts through all of the dial, on the dial of a 43mm Bathyscaphe. The movement used is the 1315DD, a development of the 2007 50 Fathoms movement with a 5-day power reserve and the day-date complication. In 2019, Blancpain clearly wanted to go the whole hog and decided to produce 3 flavours of its vintage remakes from 3 very different forms of 50 Fathoms. From the 45mm version, the Nageur de Combat edition was produced. In an all-brushed 45mm stainless steel case, this watch, which translates as Combat Divers, is an homage to the second generation dive watches notably offered to the French and US navies. These featured a triangle marker at 12 and white painted hands with a pencil shape. The remake offers many of these features in perhaps the most austere of modern 50 Fathoms, with even the 50 Fathoms script moved to the bottom half of the dial to reduce clutter, and the hands are simply painted white in vintage style. The only dial addition is a 7 in gloss black relief placed at the 6 o'clock position, which symbolises the safe depth limit for diving breathing pure oxygen before it becomes toxic. The caseback, now solid, displays the French Navy's emblem. From the 40.3mm 50 Fathoms, Blancpain decided to bring back the Barracuda, a watch distributed to Germany's Bundesmarine in the 1960s, and later sold to the general public as well in perhaps only 150 pieces. The name came from the original distributor, by the way. Using the smaller 1151 caliber 50 Fathoms as a template, the beige and red markers of the original, as well as its Blancpain 50 Fathoms Automatique text, were added to a matte black dial to give a delightful warmth. A key addition was the date at 3 o'clock, and a much finer bezel beading on the top of the bezel to mimic the original. The remake, however, did not adopt the fully graduated bezels seen on that original watch from the 1960s. Providing a very different flavour, the third watch of 2019 was perhaps the best received, the 50 Fathoms Bathyscaphe limited edition for Hodinkee. Replacing the mid-1950s 50 Fathoms, this used the case and movement of the 38mm Bathyscaphe, that's the caliber 1153 by the way, but removed the date and gave a very simple grey-black dial with square painted Arabic numerals and white painted pencil hands. The bezel was unchanged, but a lovely distinction from other variants was the text used for the Bathyscaphe text, which, although an anachronism in relation to the rest of the design, has beautiful serifs from the period. In 2020, this watch was followed by yet another Hodinkee release, the 50 Fathoms Mil-Spec limited edition for Hodinkee. Launched as a second generation, so to speak, to the watch offered by Blancpain in 2017, this piece celebrated the Mil-Spec 50 Fathoms, with the 40.3mm version fitted with a more recent movement, albeit one heavily based on the 1151, no date, a brushed case and small bead bezel as seen on the Barracuda. Other changes included a flat black dial and the removal of the Blancpain logo from the dial and the Blancpain name from the case side for simplicity's sake. In my opinion, the biggest change was the redesigning of the bezel with numerals in a vintage rounded aesthetic. And finally, in 2021, we come to the final watch in this video and this lineage of heritage-inspired pieces, a watch hailed as the very best 50 Fathoms vintage remake to date, the 2021 50 Fathoms No Rad. 11 years after the first No Rad, we really can see how vintage remakes have moved on. I don't need to repeat the history, but this watch takes a much more accurate, yet arguably less detailed approach to bringing back the past. The model chosen is the same format as the 40.3mm Barracuda, and so has the small bezel grips, 3 o'clock date, and polished case. The bezel is also redesigned to offer full graduations, and the dial is matte black with the no radiations marker printed directly on and not recessed like in 2010. Text is reduced to just Blancpain 50 Fathoms, and the second track is, in a new but historically accurate move for the 50 Fathoms, a connected track around the edge of the dial. Paired with white hands, this watch is probably the most historically accurate model yet, and in some ways also one of the simpler models too. But what do you think of these 50 Fathoms variants? Which is your favourite? Is it a big, bold 45mm version, or is it perhaps one of the more recent remakes which, whilst not as lavish, are perhaps more accurate and historically sound? Let me know in the comments section below. If you enjoyed this video, please remember to like, share and subscribe, and to hit the bell icon to always hear about the newest videos. Thank you very much for watching. This is Armon from WatchChronicler.com. Out.